You've probably heard of the Brazilian gold cycle as a time of wealth and prosperity. Textbooks show cities filled with churches covered in gold, merchants getting rich overnight, and the Portuguese Empire thriving on precious metal pulled from the earth. But the reality, once you step inside a colonial gold mine, is far darker. What looked like a dream of fortune for the elites was, in practice, a daily hell for thousands of people. Mostly enslaved Africans and indigenous workers forced into labor. For every gram of gold that reached the crown, entire lives were destroyed underground. The glitter that adorned crowns and altars came from suffocating, pitch-black tunnels where men, women, and even children struggled to survive a few hours at a time. Contemporary accounts speak of broken promises. Adventurers who believed they would strike it rich quickly ended up sick, indebted, and often dead, without ever holding a single nugget of gold in their hands. Gold carried an irresistible illusion, but behind its shine lay a world of violence, disease, and despair. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Stepping into a Brazilian colonial gold mine meant signing your own death sentence. This was the true golden hell. Entering a colonial gold mine wasn't just walking through a door. It was descending into a claustrophobic labyrinth, a space that seemed to swallow any hope of return. The tunnels were narrow, so tight that many had to squeeze sideways, pressing their chests against solid rock. The heat rose with every step. The air grew thinner, and the total darkness was broken only by the flickering flames of torches, releasing suffocating smoke. Imagine crawling through an opening barely wide enough for a human body, knowing that if a single rock collapsed, there would be no way out. Miners carried on their faces the certainty that any descent could be their last. And most of the time, it was. Travelers of the era described it as walking into the mouth of a monster, slowly closing behind you. There were no guarantees of light, fresh air, or even enough space to turn back. This wasn't just forced labor. It was an underground prison where every second drained breath, strength, and life. The outcome was clear. Those who went down rarely came back the same. Some never came back at all. Inside a colonial mine, the air wasn't just heavy. It was invisible poison. Every breath meant filling your lungs with rock dust, quartz particles, and smoke from the torches. The soot clung to throats. The dust built up in lungs, and the sensation was like drowning on dry land. Accounts from the time describe miners coughing up blood after hours of labor, as if their lungs were being sanded from the inside out. The tallow torches, dim at best, released thick smoke that formed a toxic haze, burning the eyes until they streamed with tears. And then there was the thin air. The deeper you went, the more suffocating it became. Oxygen simply couldn't reach those depths. Many collapsed mid-shift and never woke up. Others suffered hallucinations before losing consciousness, as if the air itself were mocking their fragility. Work in there meant breathing your own demise. A place where even the most natural act breathing turned into a deadly gamble. If the air was already an enemy inside colonial mines, water was a silent executioner. Tunnel after tunnel, Brazil's underground was constantly threatened by seepage, groundwater, and sudden floods. A single heavy rain outside could turn narrow shafts into deadly water traps. Miners worked with their feet permanently soaked, wading in mud that sometimes reached their knees. The cold water gnawed at their bones, while the constant threat of a sudden flood loomed over them. Many drowned just meters from the exit, swallowed by torrents of mud and stone. Attempts at control were primitive buckets, pulleys, enslaved workers lined up in human chains, passing containers hand to hand in a futile race against nature. Hours of labor could be undone in minutes as the tunnels filled again. For those trapped underground, the feeling was unmistakable. At any moment, the ceiling could collapse, and the tunnel could become a river of no return. Inside the mine, the choice was brutal. Fight the water or drown. Time inside a colonial gold mine didn't follow the ticking of a clock, but the cruel rhythm of exhaustion. For the enslaved workers, there were no shifts, only an endless cycle of darkness and physical strain until the body collapsed. They were forced to dig, haul, and sift for hours on end, often without seeing daylight for days at a time. The absolute darkness disoriented the mind. Losing track of time was common, and many believed only hours had passed when in fact it had been days. Extreme fatigue was inevitable. Arms trembled, legs buckled, eyes burned from smoke. Many simply collapsed on top of their own work, crushed by falling rocks or buried under the loads they carried. 2 overseers. This wasn't a sign of concern, but of punishment. Those who stopped were whipped until they stood again. Collapse wasn't the exception. It was the rule. In the mines, the human body was treated like a disposable tool, used until it broke, then replaced by another. Working there wasn't living. It was surviving minute by minute until the inevitable fall. The very tools meant to extract gold were, in practice, weapons turned against the miners themselves. Rusted pickaxes, makeshift shovels, and rickety wooden carts were always ready to cause accidents. A single miscalculated swing could slash the skin of the worker beside you, or a loose stone could collapse onto an exhausted body. And that wasn't all. Over time, colonizers began using gunpowder to open passages more quickly. What looked like progress became a nightmare. Blasts were poorly calculated, carried out with no safety measures. Miners were often buried alive, struck by shrapnel, or simply suffocated by the toxic smoke that filled the tunnels after the detonation. Each workday was a grim lottery. You might walk out with hands full of dirt and pockets still empty, or never walk out at all. Records from the time mention accidents so frequent they were treated as routine. For the masters, a lost life was just another number. For those who descended underground, it was a constant reminder that the tool in your hand could just as easily become the instrument of your death. In colonial gold mines, the human body was treated as nothing more than another tool of labor, disposable and replaceable. Enslaved Africans and indigenous people were bought, sold, and traded like mere commodities, valued not for who they were, but for the strength of their muscles and their ability to endure pain. The life expectancy of someone forced to work in the mines was shockingly short. On average, less than 7 years after beginning. The toll was brutal. Twisted spines, destroyed lungs, open wounds that never healed. When a body could no longer endure, there was no rest, only replacement. An exhausted enslaved worker was swapped out like a broken pickaxe. Even worse, records show masters calculated the useful lifespan of an enslaved person against the price of the gold they extracted. To them, losing a man was merely a financial loss, nothing more. A human life wasn't seen as sacred. It was reduced to currency. In that world, dignity simply vanished. The body, reduced to numbers and statistics, was consumed to its absolute limit and beyond. While the Portuguese crown grew rich from tons of gold extracted from Brazil, the very workers, especially the enslaved, barely had anything to eat. The gold fever consumed all resources, but food was scarce, poor in quality, and often spoiled before even reaching the tunnels. Accounts speak of moldy flour, dried meat, crawling with worms, and muddy water. For many, meals consisted of thin gruels, completely inadequate to sustain hours of back-breaking labor. It wasn't uncommon for miners to face a grim choice. Spend what little strength they had digging, or save it just to survive the next day. The contrast was brutal. While gold decorated altars and palaces in Europe, the bodies that pulled it from the earth were wasting away with hunger. Malnutrition left visible scars, protruding bones, peeling skin, sunken eyes, and exhaustion that never lifted. Gold fed empires, but those who mined it died with empty stomachs. It was proof that in colonial mines, the wealth of the few was built on the hunger of the many. In the colonial mines, disease wasn't an exception. It was destiny. The human body simply couldn't withstand the cocktail of horrors underground. Poisoned air, rotten food, filthy water, and endless shifts. Every worker carried in their body the signs of an imminent collapse. Tropical fevers were relentless. Malaria and yellow fever wiped out lives swiftly, leaving entire lines of miners bedridden or dead within days. Intestinal worms spread easily, fueled by dirty water and constant contact with contaminated mud. The result was a workforce consumed by pain, diarrhea, and unshakable weakness. And then came the invisible toll of dust-filled air. lungs slowly destroyed. Chronic coughs turned into hemorrhages until the simple act of breathing became unbearable. For many, every breath felt like a knife stabbing the chest. In the mines, death rarely came through sudden accidents. More often, it crept in the form of disease. A sentence without trial, inevitable and cruel. If the mine was already a living hell, the presence of overseers turned every tunnel into a field of terror. The whip was the law, and any sign of fatigue or defiance became grounds for brutal punishment. Slowing the swing of a pickaxe was enough to hear the sharp crack of leather slicing through the air, reminding everyone that stopping wasn't an option. The punishments went far beyond whipping. Enslaved workers were forced to carry extra loads as penalties or chained to work with limited mobility. Some were thrown into damp cells without food, serving only as a warning to the rest. The cruelty wasn't just physical, but psychological. Overseers patrolled the corridors in silence, watching constantly, ready to punish even a glance deemed insubordinate. It was a system of relentless surveillance, where fear replaced any hope. There was no room for mistakes, no room for humanity. The goal wasn't only to extract gold from the earth, but to crush the will of those who minded. In the end, the tunnel wasn't just an underground prison. It was also a stage of continuous torture, where every worker lived under the shadow of imminent punishment. The gold of the mines didn't belong to those who extracted it, but to the crown and the masters. For the enslaved, touching even a grain of gold without permission was considered treason. And the punishment was so cruel, it was often worse than death itself. Surveillance was obsessive. Overseers searched mouths, nostrils, hair, even open wounds, looking for tiny nuggets hidden away. Some accounts describe enslaved workers being forced to spit or swallow salt water to prove they hadn't concealed gold dust in their throats. And when someone was accused of theft, the punishment came with chilling cruelty. Hands cut off, bodies branded with hot irons, whippings until unconsciousness. Others were hanged in public squares as a warning, not just to the accused, but to anyone who dared imagine keeping even a fragment of the wealth they produced. The paradox was clear. Those who risked their lives to pull gold from the earth had no right even to touch it. For the workers, that golden shine was a curse. The closer they were to it, the further away they were from freedom. In colonial mines, silence wasn't a sign of peace. It was the most terrifying warning of all. When tunnels collapsed, the sound began as a distant crack, a faint tremor, and then nothing! The noise stopped, and emptiness filled the underground. That was the moment fear spread among the miners, because they knew someone was about to be trapped under tons of rock. Caverns were frequent, waterlogged soil, poorly calculated explosions. An unskilled digging turned the ceilings of galleries into traps waiting to collapse. Those nearby could sometimes hear the muffled screams of companions crushed by the mountain's weight. But nothing could be done. More often than not, digging to rescue only meant burying them deeper. That silence, broken only by cries that quickly faded, haunted everyone who remained alive. It was the cruel reminder that at any moment, their fate could be the same. To vanish in darkness, suffocated beneath the very earth from which they pulled gold. Underground, there were no funerals, no farewells, only heavy silence. And gold stained with tragedy. In the dark heart of colonial mines, faith was as essential as the air that was missing. Every worker carried beliefs, prayers, and superstitions that served as the only relief in the face of constant terror. Enslaved Africans invoked in protective spirits. Indigenous people relied on ancestral rituals, while Portuguese miners clung to Catholic saints and amulets made from bones, stones, ribbons, or tiny crucifixes were kept with the same seriousness as a work tool. Some believed certain prayers could prevent caverns, while others swore that singing while digging kept evil spirits away. But faith was also entangled with fear. Many believed the mines were cursed, that gold carried not only wealth, but the wrath of vengeful spiritual forces. Whispers of trapped souls in the tunnels, voices echoing in the dark, and ominous signs of disaster spread among the miners. Between faith and superstition, one truth was clear. Without something to believe in, no one could survive the psychological weight of the mine. The colonial towns that today dazzle tourists with golden churches and historic mansions were built on an invisible foundation. The bodies of thousands of workers who died in the mines. Every cobblestone street, every gilded altar, every palace of the Portuguese crown was paid for with human lives, drained to their last breath underground. Official records rarely mention these deaths. 2 colonial administrators, enslaved people and miners were mere numbers, replaceable, disposable. But reality was different. The mines functioned as underground cemeteries, where buried bodies were never recovered, where disease silently claimed hundreds, and where working until death was routine. While priests consecrated churches with gold ripped out by pickaxe blows, entire families mourned losses that were never acknowledged. The shine that illuminated altars and crowns masks the darkness of a system that consumed people as fuel. The true price of colonial wealth was just the gold ship to Lisbon. It was a legacy of pain, etched into the land and into the blood of those who never got to enjoy what they produced. Surviving a single day in a colonial gold mine was nearly impossible. Every minute, on the ground stretched into eternity, between suffocating air, muffled screams of accidents, and the crushing weight of surveillance and fear. It wasn't only the body that broke. The mind collapsed too. Extreme exhaustion, constant hunger, the terror of punishment, and the ever-present shadow of death created an environment where hope simply didn't exist. Living 24 hours in that underground world wasn't he living. It was merely postponing the inevitable sentence. That's why saying you wouldn't survive a day in a colonial mine is no exaggeration. It was a historical reality proven by the thousands who perished there. Nameless, unrecorded, without justice. Every grain of gold extracted was paid for in human blood. The shine that dazzled kings and empires hid a terrible truth. Gold was never just a precious metal. It was eternity stolen from all those who died to make it gleam.